Spaceballs, the video essay. Who doesn't love a good parody every once in a while? You know, taking a certain property and putting your own spin on it in a comedic way? The practice is extremely common nowadays, especially with sites such as YouTube and Newgrounds, but it's been a thing for a long while. Some parodies even date as far back as the early 1900s, and ever since then, it's taken many forms throughout the years. Heck, there are some that have based their whole careers around parodies and have been quite successful at it. Just look at Weird Al Yankovic. Of course, like with every other piece of media, you got your good ones, and you got your bad ones. And parody films are no exception. With this type of genre, you have to be really careful about what you do with it. On the one hand, you get Spaceballs, but on the other hand, you get painful, agonizing failure, also known as disaster movie. This is an interesting topic for me to talk about because when it comes to parody films, you just don't see much of them being made anymore. Like, at all. The closest we've gotten to a recent parody film is the satirical biopic Weird the Al Yankovic Story. But other than that, parody as a genre just seems to have completely vanished from cinema as a whole. I think there could be tons of potentially amazing ideas for parody films with the film writers we have today. Hell, there's still some older parody films that are to this day considered hilarious classics. But wait a minute, if the genre was so popular back in the older days, why exactly did it die out? What did those older parody films have that the newer ones completely failed to achieve? Well, that's what we're here to find out. And the way I'm going to do it is take a look at what is considered to arguably be the best parody movie, and compare it to what most agree, myself included, is the worst parody movie. The gold standard for how all spoof movies should be, versus the textbook example of how not to make a parody movie. Now, to be clear, the overall goal of this video is not going to be in the sense of which film is better, since, well, the answer is a no-brainer. Doing that would basically be apples and oranges. No, what I'm doing today is analyzing these films purely on how they go about doing their goals as parody films, looking at exactly what makes one work and the other not work. Obviously, there will be major spoilers here for both films. If you haven't seen Disaster Movie, I envy you. But if you haven't seen Spaceballs, well, what are you even doing here? Go, watch it now, do it. Let's not waste any more time here. This is Spaceballs versus Disaster Movie. Roll it. Before we get into the two main attractions, I want to briefly go over what a parody actually is and what it should strive for. Generally, a parody is when someone takes a certain work or concept and spins it on its head, poking fun at it by putting a satiric/comedic spin on it. And there's no one type of parody either. This can be done in many different ways and in different levels. Taking a song and changing the lyrics to it while still keeping the melody, taking a certain trope and exaggerating it to comedic effect, taking a story's plotline or characters and poking fun at it throughout, that sort of stuff. Now, of course, comedy is subjective. Not everybody shares the same style of humor, and it can take different levels and approaches to make different people laugh, which extends to parodies as well. That being said, most parodies share a common goal, which is to provide commentary on or criticize a certain work by using comedy, whether positive or negative. For Spaceballs, it's a clear parody of the original Star Wars trilogy, poking fun at its characters and cliches, while with Disaster Movie, I guess it's both a parody on the disaster film genre with 2008 movies thrown in the mix. I have a lot to say on that, but we'll get to that topic later on. And just like with any other style of humor, no matter what the setup is, the parody's effectiveness hinders on execution. For a parody to work, it has to accomplish its goal of why it's parodying its subject in the first place. It has to have a purpose for existing, a reason for choosing this particular subject for parodying and what it's poking fun at. Without it, the joke falls flat. Because after all, if you're recreating a work but not doing anything meaningful with it, what's the point of doing so in the first place? With that, all you'd essentially be doing is recreating the source material on a lower budget. So, with this structuring in mind, how did these two films handle themselves? Well, unsurprisingly, despite them both being in the parody genre, their approaches and impacts could not be more different. Let's start with Spaceballs. The movie, originally released in 1987, 4 years after the then most recent Star Wars film Return of the Jedi came out, was made as an affectionate parody towards the ever-popular Star Wars movies. Due to the Star Wars films being immensely successful financially and making its undeniable impact in pop culture, of course such a topic was ripe for parody. So how does the movie handle spoofing such a popular franchise? Well, it actually does so in a pretty clever way, at least for the time. One of the main things it does is take the more well-known characters from the Star Wars trilogy and create XPs of them, meaning they're extremely reminiscent of the characters they're parodying. For example, the main character Lone Star is a composite XP of both Luke Skywalker and Han Solo, having part of Luke's general storylines with having mystical powers and being the main hero to face off the bad guy, while also having Han's rugged outlaw personality and also some of his traits like owing random space creatures money and being the co-pilot of a rusty spaceship. Even his name reflects this. Lone Star. He has the lone wolf personality and traits of Han, while also being a shining star of hope for the galaxy, like how Luke was. He's an XP of Han Solo and Luke Skywalker. It's a good way of having your own character exclusively for the film, while also being a clear parody of already well-known characters. Not only is it the best of both worlds, but it also gives the character some originality to it, so that we can view and follow the character on its own, having it be more than just a Luke Skywalker parody. Most of the other major characters are like this too. Princess Vespa is an XP of Princess Leia, Barf is an XP of Chewbacca, Dot Matrix is an XP of C-3PO, Yogurt is an XP of Yoda, you get the idea. But just like with Lone Star, these characters have their own personalities as well. For example, Princess Vespa is depicted early on as a spoiled daddy's girl that is self-absorbed due to her royal status. At the start of the film, Vespa tries to escape her arranged wedding on her own, save for Dot Matrix, but at the first sign of danger, she immediately tries to call her father to come rescue her. This is intentionally a sharp personality contrast to Leia, who, despite her princess status, is a strong leader that makes her rebel status clear, and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty when the time comes for it. The clash between Vespa's uptight princessy personality and Lone Star's outlaw scruffiness makes for good chemistry between the two characters, and ultimately fuels both their personality arcs through the film, with both of them getting over their initial flaws and having their feelings for each other grow throughout the story. Barf shares similarities to his original counterpart Chewbacca, with how he's the scruffy animalistic sidekick and co-pilot with the main heroes, but he also differs from Chewie in how he acts throughout the film. He's like if Chewbacca was mixed with the cowardly lion from The Wizard of Oz. He is cowardly at some points and often gives into his more animalistic tendencies, given that he's half man, half dog, but otherwise he's very happy and kind-hearted, often acting as the comic relief of the group. And yes, I know that sounds odd given that the entire cast is meant to be comedic, but Barf is arguably the most comedy-focused. He describes himself as his own best friend, and as such, is a very close and loyal companion to Lone Star, having enough cowardice in him to be realistic, but also not too much to make him pathetic or unlikable. Plus, he's played by John Candy. You can't really go wrong there. Dot Matrix admittedly doesn't have as much characterization since she's the most underutilized of the group, but I feel she still has enough to talk about. In the Star Wars films, C-3PO is a protocol droid who is mainly known for being overly worried about everything. He tries to initially be polite wherever he goes, since it's baked into his programming, but he will get in a sarcastic comment or two when he gets annoyed, as his interactions with his companion R2-D2 show. Dot Matrix is like this too, but with a little bit more raunchiness thrown in. She is played by Joan Rivers after all. But since there's no R2-D2 counterpart in this universe, here she's the companion to Princess Vespa. From the moment they're introduced, the two constantly have interactions with each other, often with Dot being overly protective over Vespa. She acts as somewhat of a maternal figure for Vespa, being supportive of her relationship with Lone Star, but also having her protectiveness get in the way when things start to go too far. She's got the companion traits of C-3PO, with a little bit more added in to make her a noteworthy character. And speaking of noteworthy characters, I freaking love Yogurt. Especially with Strawberry. Yogurt, who's played by the film's director Mel Brooks, is meant to initially fill the role of the Yoda/Obi-Wan parody, with a little bit of Wizard of Oz thrown in too, with him being the reclusive, wise old master and the one to teach Lone Star about the mystical power called the Schwartz. But what they do with him is friggin' hilarious. I'll get more into him later on, but I promise it's worth it. These are characters that, while being clear parodies of well-known Star Wars characters, have their own personalities to them that makes them stand out and become iconic characters of their own. But by far, the biggest and best example of this is none other than the main villain of the film, Dark Helmet. Of course, he too is also an XP of a Star Wars character, this obviously being Darth Vader, but there's a lot more to Dark Helmet's character than just that. If I had to describe who he was, I'd say he was comparable to Lord Farquaad from Shrek, in which he sees himself as an intimidating and all-powerful force of evil, when in reality, He's a hilariously incompetent man-child that resorts to ridiculous measures to get what he wants, like stealing an entire planet's air, or going ludicrous speed to catch up to the heroes despite how risky a move it is. He tries to make himself sound intimidating and make his subjects and opponents feel like he's in control, but it doesn't take much for his mask to slip, both figuratively and literally, and reveal himself as a whiny, sarcastic dweeb. Not to mention, out of all the characters in the film, he's the one who suffers the most physical abuse. He'll get smacked into the camera, or punched in the face, or even get flung into a wall and suffer a head concussion. Yet despite this, he still serves his role in the film as a legitimate threat to the main characters, like when he manipulates Princess Vespa by disguising himself as her father in order to draw her out of hiding and kidnap her. He keeps a meaningful presence throughout the story and reminds the audience that he's still a villain, as comedic as he might be. Rick Moranis brings so much life into his role as well, and was honestly perfect casting. Even the background characters are noteworthy parodies, like the Dinks being in place of the Jawas, or the Tarkin XV being named Colonel Sanders, or Pizza the Hut, which is self-explanatory, or even the titular Spaceballs being a parody of stormtroopers, especially going so far as to parody the stormtroopers' reputation of having terrible aim. To me, these are exactly how a good spoof film's characters should be. They make it clear just who and what they're parodying, and play off of / exaggerate the original character's tropes, but it also adds to the character as well, and makes it have its own identity outside of the parody aspect. It's what makes them characters, and not just shallow copies of pre-existing ones. And then you get Disaster Movie, which does the complete opposite of what I just said. Oh boy, this is gonna be painful. So, what is the main cast in Disaster Movie like? We have the main character Will, who has commitment issues with his girlfriend Amy. And that's basically it to his character, really. He's just whiny and has commitment issues. And occasionally he'll show signs of being a man-child, like when he has a super sweet 16 despite being 25. But even then he doesn't really do much, he just whines about not being able to admit his feelings to Amy. Yeah, that's it. Okay, what about Amy? She cheats on Will because he won't admit his feelings to her, and also has a job at a museum. That's a little something, I guess. Okay, but then there's Will's friend Calvin, who is just an amalgamation of all the black friend stereotypes and nothing else. Okay, you see my problem here? The main cast, who are pretty much the only non-parody characters in this entire movie, have no real defining characteristics to them aside from only one or two. And even then, those one or two characteristics are either played up too much like with Calvin, or not played up enough like with Will. They don't do anything interesting or have any real development that would otherwise make them worthwhile characters to follow. They just go through the basic motions of the story, be somehow the perfect mix of bland and unlikable, and that's it. Will's and Amy's chemistry is practically non-existent in this film. Their relationship just feels more toxic than anything. Even if having the characters be blank was the intention from the beginning, which is honestly debatable, it still falls flat. The main characters should not be shoved to the side or downplayed to this degree. There's a reason they're called the main characters. They're supposed to be the ones we mainly follow through the story, and therefore should give the audience enough reason for doing so. Think about Emmett from the Lego Movie as an example. Sure, at the start of the film he's a generic everyman that doesn't have much going for him, but that's intentionally part of his character. He's designed to be a normal, plain, everyday person that conforms to the society he's in and happily goes along with what's considered normal, to the point where even his co-workers at the construction site can't say anything definable about Emmett when asked. It's why, when Wildstyle comes along and starts him on his journey as the Special, it's effective because it starts shattering his worldview. It gives him a different perspective and has his normalness stick out in a world where everyone is different. This is what ultimately fuels his character growth throughout the film, and is how, by the end, he's matured enough to be able to develop his skills as a master builder, and also helps drive the message of the film on how anyone can be the Special, even someone as unassuming as Emmett. It's his intentional blankness that fuels his character arc and serves a key part in telling the message of the story. Disaster Movie does not do that. What it instead does with its main non-parody characters is give us flat excuses for personalities that not only do not benefit the story other than the bare minimum of the story beats, but also fails to make the main characters engaging in any way. Really, their only purpose for existing is just as devices to make way for all the parody characters in the film. And speaking of the parody characters, they're even worse. Yeah, in typical fashion of the directors Jason Freeberg and Aaron Seltzer, disaster movies' ways of parodying film characters is just ripping the characters straight from their respective films and making them shallow, unlikable copies of who they originally were. Aside from the two who joined the main cast, that being Juno and Giselle, Junie and Enchanted Princess, the other parody characters are relegated to one-off cameos that appear for one scene, serve one singular joke, and disappear for the rest of the film, with little to no plot significance other than their film just happened to come out around that year, this being 2007 to 2008. And sometimes they won't even do anything with them. They'll just have the characters blatantly say their names, as if the audience is too stupid to know who or what the character's film is.
I am Iron Man.
I am Prince Caspian.
I am Beowulf.
The only parody character I can give some leniency to is what they do with Batman, since it actually somewhat attempts to do something with the parody by changing Batman's personality from this super serious, gravelly voiced vigilante to someone who attempts to be that, but is really just this super dorky, flustered geek. It's really the only performance in this film that feels somewhat natural. Other than that, everyone else is just either mean-spirited, confusing, crude, stupid, or a combination of all four. And by far, the worst offenders are what they do with Juno and Giselle. I'm not calling them Junie or Enchanted Princess again, I refuse to stoop to that level. Let's start with Juno. Now, funny story, when I saw a disaster movie for the first time, I hadn't seen or even heard of Juno. So when I saw their parody of it, I didn't really know what to think. With my unbiased eyes, what I saw was the movie mocking what looked to be a pregnant teenager that spoke in weird teenager lingo. But when I finally did get around to seeing Juno, I actually got really invested in the story of a teenager having to deal with the difficult burdens of teen pregnancy, and how she tries to make grown-up decisions regarding such a tough situation. It had charm, it felt natural, and most importantly, at least to me, it felt real. I appreciated the calmer tones it had, and how it doesn't try to over-dramatize the plot for the sake of having drama. It got me invested in its story, and had me genuinely feeling for the characters. It also made me feel even more anger towards Disaster Movie because they completely fucked Juno's character up. In Disaster Movie, they have her be a part of the main cast only to make her be annoying to everyone, with her speaking in a bored, monotone voice and confusing the characters by commenting on everything in overly written clever for clever's sake quips. And that's not an exaggeration, they literally say word for word that's what her character does.
I speak in overly written clever for clever's sake quips.
Except guess what? That joke doesn't work because that's not what she does in her film at all. Like, not even close. The only times I can think of that would even come close to that is like 1 or 2 times, but even then they're pretty small, and they aren't written to be clever for clever's sake. They're there because they make sense for the situation Juno is in. Like for example when she yells "Thundercats or go" when she's about to give birth. That's her way of alerting her parents that her water just broke and that it's time for her to get to the hospital now. Otherwise, throughout her film, she speaks just like any regular teenager would. Being sarcastic is not a bad thing about her character, it's just her character. She's sarcastic because it's one of her ways of coping with the stressful and mentally taxing situation of being a pregnant teenager and trying to get her life together. Not once throughout her film does she speak in overly confusing reference-laden sentences like this shallow parody of her. Not only does it make no sense, but it's just straight up wrong. And yet, throughout the film, they try to intentionally paint Juno's character as annoying, to the point where when she gets killed off, spoilers, the other characters are glad to see her get brutally murdered, even being relieved by it. Yes, this pregnant teenager who had to deal with very real stress and decisions that even she knows are too grown up for her, yet still powers through it, is deemed as annoying and deserving of death because she was sarcastic. Considering the themes of the Juno film, Disaster Movie's portrayal of it is not only nonsensical, but it's also borderline offensive. And I don't mean offensive in the sense like South Park, where it's meant to offend you to make a point. It's offensive in the sense that it just feels genuinely and needlessly insulting. As for Giselle, I don't even know what direction they're trying to go with her parody, and the main reason for this is because it's redundant. In her original movie Enchanted, Giselle's entire existence was meant to be as a living parody of the typical Disney princess tropes. You know the ones: wears pretty dresses, sings to animals, reminisces about her prince, airheaded but still overly kind, that sort of thing. Basically, she's what Drawn Together does with Princess Clara, except this one's a lot more family-friendly. Enchanted was already a parody to begin with, since it was essentially Disney making fun of themselves, so Disaster Movie making a parody of that is pointless because it completely kills the original joke. It's exaggeratingly criticizing something that Enchanted was already exaggeratingly criticizing. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the way they write the Giselle parody isn't even funny or clever in the slightest. From the moment she comes in, Not Giselle is portrayed as a loud, annoying, airheaded drug addict that contributes absolutely nothing meaningful to the plot and is just there to make crude jokes. Basically, she's what Drawn Together does with Princess Clara in Season 3. Half the time the joke with her is just, hee hee, I'm on drugs, or hee hee, I'm an edgy Disney princess. Ironically, it's even more annoying than the Juno parody they were intentionally trying to make annoying. And it's not even consistent either. Sometimes Not Giselle will just straight up go against her already pre-established character for the purpose of making a joke. A good example of this is when she complains about glass slippers being hard to run in, and lifts her dress to show them being completely smashed, causing her to be in pain. As shallow and overdone as that joke already would have been, here it's made even worse by the fact that not too long ago, we saw her literally eating glass, and she seemed just fine, overjoyed even. So they can't even get that part of her character right. And then, to top it all off, just when you think Not Giselle can't get any worse, she does, well, this.
You a dude? I'm a tranny. I thought you knew.
The less said about that scene, the better. So, to recap this section, Spaceballs parodies characters by creating XPs that, while clearly exaggerated versions of Star Wars characters, have personalities and characteristics of their own that make them likable and entertaining in their own right, while still sticking to the main parody goal. Disaster Movie just rips the characters out of the movies they set to parody and turns them into shallow, annoying, unfunny copies, while being inconsistent with their writing and making them overall unpleasant to watch. But of course, there's more to making a movie than just the characters. They're a major part, sure, but they're far from the only factor. Another important aspect of filmmaking is how the entire thing looks. After all, cinema is at heart a visual media, so how do these films use that opportunity to their advantage? From the theme of this video, I think you can already guess where this is going. Before I get into the real meat of the visuals regarding Spaceballs, I want to give a little bit of backstory trivia. When this film was in its early production stages, director Mel Brooks actually got into contact with creator of Star Wars, George Lucas. Brooks wanted to make sure that his parody was going to be as close to the original as possible, so he went ahead and sent the script of Spaceballs to Lucas in order to give him a heads up on what he was doing, and also to make sure he had permission to do the parody in the first place so he wouldn't get sued. Lucas ended up loving the script and gave Brooks his blessing, on the condition that no merchandise would be sold. This was an understandable condition, seeing as how any Spaceballs merch would have most likely looked too similar to actual Star Wars merch. On the upside, it did give us this scene.
Merchandising, merchandising, where the real money from the movie is made.
But it wasn't just Lucas's blessing that Brooks got out of showing it to him. Along with it, Brooks also ended up getting permission to hand over Spaceballs to Lucas's visual effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, the same company that worked on the VFX for Star Wars. And boy does it show. The sets in this film are genuinely impressive, even by parody standards, and a majority of them really do add to the atmosphere of it being in a Star Wars-like universe. The ships, the kingdom, Yogurt's underground base, they're all incredibly well crafted and put together, not to mention they also fit the characters and their personalities. To show you what I mean, let's go through each of them one by one. Lone Star and Barf's ship, the Eagle 5, is of course a parodic take on the Millennium Falcon driven by Han and Chewie, with a few differences. The most major being that the Eagle 5 is not a typical spaceship at all. It's a flying RV car, specifically a 1986 Winnebago Chieftain 33. Much like how the Falcon was a normal space freighter modified into a smuggler ship, the Eagle 5 is a normal RV modified into a ship, as shown by its exterior, where it has wings and boosters attached onto the sides of what would otherwise be an ordinary vehicle. This is where Lone Star and Barf spend most of their days when they're not on missions, and as such have made it their little home. The interior has a good bit of the environment you'd normally expect from a well-used RV. Various trinkets on the dashboard, miscellaneous garbage strewn on the floors and counters, clothes and towels hung up on racks on the walls, that sort of thing. But it also mixes it with the sci-fi controls and lights you'd expect to find on a spaceship like the Falcon. The whole thing has the main color of beige, much like the outfits that Barf and Lone Star wear, and the entire thing has a well-used, homely feel to it. This is their main base. It's where they feel the most comfortable and where they plan most of their escapades. It reflects Barf and Lone Star's scruffy personalities, and fits with the type of environment you'd expect them to live in. Princess Vespa's home, planet Druidia, has a royal and elegant kingdom setting, much like Vespa herself, especially in the wedding scenes. It's lush and inviting, which fits with it being a parody of Princess Leia's home planet Alderaan. Except, well, this one doesn't blow up. Here, planet Druidia is a place home to many natural resources, especially with its large supply of fresh air. One look at it, and you can instantly tell why other people will be interested in it, which is also due in part to the giant glass dome surrounding the whole planet, and also provides a window as to why Vespa is the way she is. Princess Vespa considers herself to be of high class and sticks to her royal roots, so her home planet being overly royal adds to this immensely since it was the environment she was raised in all her life. Even if we don't get to see it as much in the film, what we do see fits Vespa's character perfectly. Dark Helmet's ship, appropriately titled the Spaceball 1, is extremely reminiscent of ships that will belong to the Empire, like the Death Star or the Star Destroyers. But along with that, it also leaves room and potential for so many visual gags, both inside and outside the ship itself, and by golly does it take those opportunities. From the moment the film starts after the opening title crawl, the first shot we see is of the Spaceball 1, with a long panning shot of the ship, taking a whole minute and 30 seconds just to fly from one side of the camera to the other, to the point where even the background orchestra gets tired of it. Not only does that serve as a good parody of the opening to A New Hope, but having the ship be as long as it is befitting of Dark Helmet's character. He sees himself as more important and more imposing than he actually is, and the ship's exterior design reflects that. This remains consistent with the inside of the ship as well, being filled with so many different hallways and rooms, including a shopping mall, a three-ring circus, and a zoo. The amount of visual gags that happen inside the Spaceball 1 are abundant, and yet they don't feel out of place, like the gag with the coffee machine being next to the radar machine, or the movie shelf having all of Mel Brooks' past movie work. It has so much packed into it, and it's where most of the movie's visual gags take place, giving a bigger comedic edge to the villains and working hand in hand with their already entertaining performances. Plus, it also has some incredibly impressive visual effects for when the ship transforms into Megamaid. It still holds up even today. The desert moon of Vega is not really much to talk about on its own aside from the cone gag. It's mainly just a Tatooine parody and not much else, but it does lead to what I think is my favorite set in the whole film, Yogurt's home. This, to me, is a good example of how a film that focuses mainly on parodying one topic, in this case Star Wars, can also work in references to other works of media as well. Here it's incorporating a shout-out towards Wizard of Oz, with the gigantic, intimidating-looking statue of a well-known figure being accompanied with a loud, booming voice, but really just controlled by a guy who isn't that terrifying at all. Funnily enough, this film was actually shot on the same soundstage as Wizard of Oz. Go figure. The torchlit hallways made out of stone and sand look incredible, like something straight out of a fantasy film. Along with it being where Yogurt trains Lone Star in the ways of the Schwartz, like how Yoda taught Luke Skywalker on using the Force, its whole presentation really makes it feel like an important room to be in, though it does take a lot more of a comedic turn with the merchandising scene. This was made by Mel Brooks as a loving jab towards George Lucas in response to the no merchandise request, and it's my favorite scene in the film. What really does it for me is how some of the Spaceballs merch used in this scene is clearly just Transformers merch with the Spaceballs logo slapped on. It's the intentional cheapness of this scene that really sells the whole thing. And what's better is, while this scene was an intentional jab to Lucas, it doesn't feel mean-spirited or forced. It fits with the wacky tone of the film so you can still get a good laugh out of it even if you aren't aware of the context of it. And if you are aware, you can still tell that it was made in good fun. It's everything a good joke scene should be. The film also uses a lot of the same filming techniques that were used for the Star Wars films, which helps with adding to Mel Brooks' goal of wanting the parody to feel close to the original. A good example of this is the wide shots of the villain ship, the Spaceball 1, where it does what Empire Strikes Back did with the AT-ATs and uses a small-scale model for the ship. It also has some pretty nice usages of digital effects as well, like with the Schwartz lightsabers. It does show its cheapness at times, especially with the blue screen, but it's never to an extent where it's distracting. It really gives the film an authentic feel and helps the audience get immersed in this parodic universe. Disaster Movie, on the other hand, does not. The sets in this film are barely worth talking about because there's not much to them. The most detailed set we get out of the whole film is the Indiana Jones-like tomb inside the museum when they return the Crystal Skull. And admittedly, this doesn't look terrible. It at least has some effort put into it. But it also feels, well, cramped, small. It only consists of one short hallway, a pedestal for the skull, and a stained glass window. That's it. One of the big jokes with this scene, aside from the short Indiana Jones gag, is they decide to swing across the room to get to the pedestal. Okay, but why? There's nothing standing between the characters and the pedestal, no trap or obstacle whatsoever that would justify having to swing across it. And yeah, I know, it's supposed to parody how Indiana swings across things using his whip, but the way the set is designed ruins that joke because there's no in-universe reason for it. It's just a regular floor. There's nothing stopping them from just walking to the pedestal. How sad is it that the best looking set of the film still has enough problems that it negates the purpose of one of its jokes? Aside from that, the rest of the sets are what I like to describe as boring and cheap. There's nothing to make them stand out or help the audience get immersed. It's literally just some regular old rooms and streets you'd find just from walking outside. Seriously, I'm struggling here to write anything about the sets used in Disaster Movie because there's nothing to them. It has Will's bedroom, the Sweet 16 party, the city streets, an abandoned warehouse, and a museum. That's it. It doesn't match the characters, it doesn't look interesting, and it's overall so boring. It's just sticking a random batch of pop culture characters into our regular everyday world without utilizing it in any way, because that's definitely a concept that works so well. And you know another sad thing? These types of Seltzerberg movies didn't used to have this problem. Take a look at their previous film, Epic Movie. Don't get me wrong, that film's still awful and has a lot of the same problems as Disaster Movie, but one thing I personally feel it did get right is the set design. Sure, those sets are mainly just ripped from the movies they're parodying, but they're still distinguishable and recognizable sets regardless. There was clearly some actual time and effort put into replicating the movie sets. Narnia, The Wardrobe, Hogwarts, Wonka's Chocolate Factory, Jack Sparrow's pirate ship. These sets all feel distinguishable from each other and fit the characters' respective parodies. They're appealing to look at, for the most part, and actually have some effort put into them. You don't get that at all with Disaster Movie. There's no parody world here to follow or get immersed in. It's just our normal world. And our normal world is boring. Even the visual effects are lame and cheap. Nothing in this movie looks believable in any way. The actual effects are far and few, and what is done looks terrible. A good example of this is during their Speed Racer parody segment, when Not Giselle decides to hijack the Mach 5, Mach 5.5, and kills Speed Racer himself in doing so, by shooting him 35 times with a pistol. The scene hurts my very soul. As bad enough as this scene is, it's not even executed properly. The gun's slider doesn't move, there's no blood or bullet holes, the muzzle flash is just a PNG, the entire thing just looks like a bad middle school project. I have a lot more problems with the Speed Racer scene, but we'll get to that later. But there's still another part of the visuals we haven't talked about yet, the costuming. In Spaceballs, it's a mix of the characters they're meant to be XPs of, and also just being clothing that fits the characters' personalities. Lone Star wears a brown leather jacket over a patterned shirt and beige pants, overall resembling the outfit worn by Indiana Jones, a role played by Han Solo's actor Harrison Ford, which was an intentional shout-out since Lucas didn't want Lone Star to dress like Han. Being the captain of his own ship and the most roguelike / adventurous of the group, it makes sense that he dress in clothing that, while comfortable and casual, would also be useful in carrying weapons and surviving in more dangerous landscapes. Barf being a dog-like creature is another intentional shout-out, this one being that Chewbacca, the character he's an XP of, was inspired by George Lucas's actual dog Indiana, so in turn, Barf is given dog-like ears, a tail, and a white patch over his eye much like an actual dog. It's a nice homage to not only Chewbacca as a character, but also connects to a bit of behind-the-scenes trivia that most hardcore Star Wars fans would likely appreciate. Princess Vespa wears a long white wedding dress, in part to her escaping from her actual wedding and not having time to change outfits. It's not only visually similar to the white robe that Princess Leia wears in A New Hope, but it also again connects to her royal upper-class status, and is a contrast from Vespa's expensive lavish clothing to Lone Star's scruffy casual outfit. Also, there's a brief scene of Vespa wearing Leia's iconic hair buns, only to take them off as a pair of headphones. It's just a funny visual gag. Dark Helmet's outfit is arguably the most iconic from this film. It's an all-black outfit consisting of a black rubber jumpsuit, black shorts, a long cape, spikes on the arms and gloves, a gold screw belt buckle, an oversized tie, and of course, the titular Dark Helmet. It's reminiscent enough of Darth Vader's outfit that you instantly recognize the parody, but when you get a closer look at it, it's weird and warped enough to be a mix between threatening and comical. It's essentially if Vader's outfit was mixed with Lord Business from the Lego Movie. Part of what made Darth Vader so threatening in the Star Wars movies was how he towered over nearly everyone and made them look small by comparison, having a looming presence over anyone he came across. So making Dark Helmet having a smaller stature serves the parody, and this outfit emphasizes that. Because, well, let's just say the shorts he wears and the cape barely even reaching his feet doesn't really do him any favors. The oversized helmet that gives Dark Helmet his name is easily what ties the whole outfit together. At a glance it looks like Vader's helmet, but it looks a lot sillier the longer you look at it. The way it's comically oversized, the triangle eyes, the shower drain mouthpiece, it all looks goofy while still being Vader-like, which is a perfect match for this goofy Vader-like character. It's an iconic outfit for a reason. The costumes in Disaster Movie, well, they're not much to write home about. And that's being nice. It's just the film characters' outfits. Cheap versions at that. Admittedly, there will occasionally be a decent costume, like what they do with Hellboy, but most of the time it's just a cheap carbon copy of what the film character happened to wear. It's nothing noteworthy. That is, until you get to, oh my god, what the hell is this? Is this supposed to be Iron Man or Plastic Man? Look at his eyes! Look at those shoulder pads! What even is this? At least with their Batman costume I can give something of a pass, since it still looks like Batman whilst having a goofy parody edge to it, like how I described Dark Helmet's costume to be. This just looks like it's trying too hard to be a knockoff version of itself. And yeah, I know, parody and all that, but there's a difference between looking cheap for the purpose of a joke, and just looking cheap. Titus Andromedon from Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt had a better knockoff Iron Man costume. This right here is just sad. And that's not even getting into their Kung Fu Panda and Alvin and the Chipmunks visuals. I think I might need eye bleach. So yeah, when it comes to visuals, Spaceballs has the memo down. It's close enough to the original to make the parody angle clear while still having its own style. Plus, having the help of the same guys who made the visuals from the thing you're parodying doesn't hurt either. Disaster Movie barely even knows how to do even the bare minimum of parody visuals, or even just visuals in general. It looks cheap, flat, and overall boring. And it's not like Disaster Movie has a real excuse for looking this crappy either. Both movies actually had a surprisingly similar budget, with Spaceballs having $22 million to work with, and Disaster Movie having $20 million. So it's not like they didn't have the money or resources to make decent visuals for Disaster Movie, especially with it being made 21 years after Spaceballs. So, what gives? And now, we come to what I think is the biggest aspect that sets these movies apart in quality, the humor. Buckle up, ladies and gentlemen. I've got a lot to say on this. Like I said near the beginning, a parody's overall goal is to put a comedic spin on a certain source material in order to criticize it and or provide commentary on it. There are many different ways to reach that goal, but the overall purpose should generally be the same. Spaceballs certainly does that. Disaster Movie is debatable. I'm gonna start with Spaceballs again, just to drive home the point of how badly Disaster Movie fails. With Spaceballs, the humor mainly stems from satirizing the original Star Wars film trilogy, that being A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. It goes without saying that these three films were insanely popular when they came out, so much so that the franchise is still going to this day. It marked a milestone in science fiction and pop culture as a whole, with the first one becoming one of the highest grossing films of all time, and inspiring tons of later works. The films gained a massive fanbase, and among that fanbase was Mel Brooks' then 10-year-old son Max. To quote the words of Mel Brooks himself, "My son Max loved the Star Wars movies. I would take him to various showings of them. And for his 10th birthday, he had a Star Wars themed birthday party. And boy did those kids love it. So I thought, science fiction. Now there's a genre I haven't wrecked yet. I destroyed the Western in Blazing Saddles. I savaged classic horror films in Young Frankenstein. I sent up silent films in Silent Movie, and I had fun with Hitchcock in High Anxiety. Of course, even though I poked fun at all these genres, in truth I dearly loved them. But there were not many genres left for me to satirize, so I eagerly attacked science fiction. It was a genre rich with opportunities for devastating satire. Mel Brooks recognized the impact Star Wars was having and saw the opportunities to be done in parodying it, since science fiction was, at the time, unexplored territory for him. He wanted to make a project that was a clear love letter to Star Wars, while also poking fun at its more ridiculous bits. And thus, Spaceballs was born. This is one of the most loving film tributes I have ever seen. Even when you look at it purely from a writing perspective, the written jokes and visual gags go hand in hand with each other to create not only compelling characters, which we've already gone over, but also outstanding humor that honestly still holds up on rewatch, even more than 30 years later. It stands the test of time beautifully. First, the written jokes, the ones baked into the script from the beginning. It does a spectacular job at telling a compelling story, while also mercilessly making fun of the plot points in various pieces of not only Star Wars, but science fiction as a whole, including references to Star Trek, Alien, Planet of the Apes, and more. A big part of what makes them work is that, while they're clearly there for a reason, they don't get in the way of the story, and they allow the plot to progress naturally, using its time wisely, and allowing the viewer to get invested while still laughing at the witty humor. That way, even if you take out a majority of the jokes, you'd still have a basic but compelling plot to follow. And this was partly intentional too. The overall plot of the film was intentionally based on the 1934 film It Happened One Night. Again, to quote Mel Brooks, "It is a story of a runaway heiress who escapes her marriage by fleeing on her wedding day from a very, very rich but very, very dull groom, and then she subsequently falls in love with an attractive wise guy commoner. We took that same basic plot and shoved it into space." Another thing that makes this dialogue work is the actors' deliveries of them. They feel so exaggerated, yet also so natural that it's genuinely hard to tell which of the dialogue was in the script to begin with, and which of it was ad-libbed, like the scene with Dark Helmet playing with his dolls. That scene was entirely Rick Moranis' doing, and we couldn't thank him enough for it. Of course, the movie does have its fair share of raunchier jokes as well, like when Dark Helmet and Lone Star are about to have a Schwartz lightsaber fight, and Dark Helmet says,
"And I see your Schwartz is as big as mine."
Or when Lone Star is giving Vespa a lift, and Dot Matrix tells Barf to stop looking up her skirt. But even these jokes work as well. Wanna know why? Because they're used sparingly. The movie knows when to land these jokes, and what degree to use them in. Done properly, raunchy jokes can indeed be funny. Done properly. Ad-libbed or not, there are so many examples of jokes that work in this film that I couldn't possibly list all of them into this video without unnecessarily bloating it, so I'll just list a few of my favorites. 1. The scene of Dark Helmet trying to get a radar machine working and complaining about it, only for it to actually be a coffee machine. It's a small joke, but it's also just funny, and a good example of how timing can affect a punchline. If it was either drawn out or had gone too quickly, it wouldn't nearly be as funny, but here it's the perfect length, and as it stands, it fits with the wacky nature of these villains. 2. The scene of the villains trying to find the location of the heroes by playing a tape of the movie while the movie is still going on. This film does have fourth wall breaking jokes, but again, they use them wisely. They're not overused or drawn out. They actually flow naturally with both the story and the movie's tone of humor, and the fourth wall break in this scene in particular is utilized in a creative way. 3. The fight scene between Lone Star and Dark Helmet, where it opens with this dialogue.
"I am your father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate."
What's that make us?
Absolutely nothing.
Not only is it a good parody of the iconic "I am your father" twist from Empire Strikes Back, but it also is another good usage of comedic timing and subverting expectations of the punchline. They could have just done similar to what Toy Story 2 did years later and played the father dialogue out near verbatim, but this goes the extra mile to subvert the punchline and add to the joke, having it be more than just the reference alone. I could go on and on about how this movie has funny dialogue, but that will be doing a huge disservice to the movie, especially with how rewatchable it is and how there can still be many jokes to look back on and maybe didn't catch on the first watch. Seriously, it's the funniest shit, go watch it now. Next, the visual comedy. I've already gone over how the visual style relates to the characters and makes way for lots of visual gags, especially the Spaceball one, but what I didn't go too much over is the gags themselves. They're great. The physical comedy in this movie has a lot of variety and leaves room for lots of different styles. These often included slapstick with the characters, mostly involving Dark Helmet, unspoken jokes referencing the original source material, such as the aforementioned Leia hairbuns gag, jokes with the set design and cheapness of it being a parody film, and much more. It has good variety, which keeps the comedy fresh and makes the audience interested in what the next joke is going to be. Much like with the written jokes, what makes the physical comedy in Spaceballs work is it all feels natural and has a good sense of comedic timing, whether the gag is actually relevant to the plot or just a one-off joke meant for a single scene. These types of wacky situations feel like ones that the characters would get into, and none of it feels forced or unneeded. They're well-paced, look visually appealing, and fit within the movie's universe. It just goes to show how much of a loving tribute Spaceballs is to Star Wars, and heck, science fiction in general. Mel Brooks made this to rip on the genre while still being its own thing within it, and suffice to say, he succeeded. Whether written or visual, Spaceballs knows how to do comedy. So what's the humor in Disaster Movie like?
Sick.
And that's only in the first 5 minutes. Before that, there's a poop joke. Even just from the concept of this film alone, there's already so many red flags. With a title like Disaster Movie, you'd expect them to parody, films that are actually in the disaster movie genre. It's not like it's an obscure genre, there are plenty of disaster film cliches to make fun of or do your own thing with. But nope, apparently not. Yeah, remember how I said that Spaceballs mainly parodies Star Wars, while also having some references to other sci-fi projects, but still kept it overall consistent? Well, with Disaster Movie, their main goal was to apparently cram as many 2008 media parodies as they could into one movie without any real rhyme or reason other than they happened to come out around that time period. To give you an idea, here's a quick rundown of all the movies and TV shows Disaster Movie tries to parody. Armageddon, Cloverfield, Twister, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, 10,000 BC, American Gladiators, My Super Sweet 16, Juno, Enchanted, High School Musical, Alvin and the Chipmunks, Kung Fu Panda, The Dark Knight, WWE, The Incredible Hulk, Step Up 2, The Streets, Iron Man, Hellboy 2, The Golden Army, Sex and the City, Hancock, Superbad, Night at the Museum, The Love Guru, Hannah Montana, Beowulf, Speed Racer, I Am Legend, The Day After Tomorrow, Jumper, No Country for Old Men, Wanted, The Matrix Revolutions, The Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian, An Inconvenient Truth, You Don't Mess with the Zohan, and Get Smart. In total, that's 35 film and TV show parodies. And that's not even counting the celebrity cameos or commercial jabs. And you want to know how many of those are actual disaster films? 3. Armageddon, Twister, and Day After Tomorrow. The rest have absolutely nothing to do with disaster films in the slightest. Why put them here in the first place? To make a point about how shallow films have become? Yes, because when I think of shallow movies, I totally think of Dark Knight, Iron Man, Juno, Speed Racer. And yet, even with this unnecessary plethora of films and shows here, they don't do anything clever with them. They just show up for one scene and drag it out to extend the runtime without serving the plot, helping the characters in any way, or even really being relevant to the thing it's supposed to be parodying. It serves about as much purpose to the film as a Family Guy cutaway gag. Most of the time, the joke is just, "Hey, remember this one movie? That's something you recognize, right? Well, what if we took that, but we made it shittier? Look, Kung Fu Panda. Look, Sex and the City. Look, Indiana Jones, except it's not really Indiana Jones. Please laugh." And when they're not shoving an abundance of raunchy, gross-out humor in your face, which happens a lot in this movie, they'll often go for the most obvious, low-hanging fruit you could possibly get out of these films. Beowulf? Oh, he barely had clothes on, so we'll just make him naked and put in a bunch of gay jokes. Amy Winehouse? Oh, we'll just make her extremely drunk and burp a lot. What's an alcohol poisoning? Alvin and the Chipmunks? Oh, they sing death metal and then suddenly have rabies and also look nightmarish. Ain't that lovely? Kill me. There is one joke I can think of that actually somewhat works. It starts off, of course, with an unfunny movie parody, this time with the film Jumper, which leads into another parody, this time of Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian. Will gets impaled on Caspian's sword, sadly this is only a dream, and Caspian says this.
He's the guy who ruined Star Wars.
For those who don't know, the film Jumper has the main character being played by Hayden Christensen, who also played Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars prequel movies, so obviously that's what this joke is referring to. But funnily enough, the main character of Disaster Movie is played by Matt Lanter, who also played Anakin, this time in the 2008 Clone Wars film and the cartoon series that spawned from it. Coincidence? I think so. The movie isn't clever enough for that to be intentional. Oh yeah, they also have a couple song parodies in this as well. They're atrocious too. I will give credit for the fact that the actors and actresses here do at least have good singing vocals. They can actually sing. But the actual songs are god-awful, those ones being the High School Musical parody and the ending song, and neither of them are funny. The High School Musical bit is a clear parody of We're All in This Together, but like all the other parodies in this movie, it does nothing but slow everything down. It doesn't develop the characters or have any real purpose to it. The lyrics are just meaningless word salad mixed with pointless celebrity cameos, and it goes on for a full 5 minutes, which is way, way too long. As for the ending song, all it is having all the previous parody characters come together to sing a parody of I'm Fucking Matt Damon. A song that was made exclusively for one Jimmy Kimmel episode, and that most of the film audience likely would never have heard of. I sure as hell didn't know what it was when I first heard this. Weird Al Yankovic, this movie is not. One of my absolute least favorite examples of how bad the parodies get in this entire 1 hour and 45 minute movie is the Speed Racer parody scene. I've already explained how it looks like crap, but that's just barely scratching the surface of it. Not Giselle hijacks the Mach 5, shoots Speed Racer 35 times, bad effects, yada yada yada. But then it does this.
What? We're just playing with my monkey. Hee hee! Ow!
So let me explain. In both the Speed Racer movie and the anime that's based on, a running gag would be that Speed's 7-year-old brother Spritle and his pet monkey Chim Chim would often stow away in the trunk of the Mach 5. Michael Jackson also had a pet monkey, and you probably already know of the rumors and lawsuits regarding Michael about if he was a pedophile or not. This scene combines all of that to use a movie to make a pedophile joke. This is genuinely some of the most shallow, tasteless, unfunny shit I've ever seen in a movie. This might not only be my least favorite scene in the movie, but also my least favorite movie scene in general. It's insulting on all sides, not only to the source material itself, not only to people who are fans of either source material, but also an insult to the audience's intelligence. Funnily enough, I actually managed to find a reason as to why a lot of these so-called parodies are as shallow as they are. It's because, get this, most of the movies that Jason and Aaron parodied here aren't even ones that they've seen. They have openly admitted that when writing their parody films, including this one, they look at the trailers for most of the movies. The trailers and nothing else. Honestly, that checks out, since half the movies parodied here hadn't even released yet by the time Disaster Movie hit theaters. It does explain a lot, but that makes most of the parodies here even worse because that makes them completely pointless. Arguably even more so than the Enchanted parody. There's doing poor research, and then there's not even having the research at your disposal to begin with. There's no joke to be made, no purpose or message to get across. It's parody in name only. You know what this reminds me of? Those awful internet animations that just took a popular piece of media and made raunchy jokes with it. You know the ones, Dorkly, Flash Kids, Gumbino, things like that. They'd often just take something that's popular at the time, for example Pokemon or Sonic, and use the characters in them to make the most shallow, surface-level jokes that everyone and their grandmother's dog has heard before. often with little to no actual research on the subject matter. But you know the difference between those videos and Disaster Movie? Those videos are, at the very least, short. They're not pleasant to watch, at least in my personal opinion. I'm sure there's an audience for them. But they're short little time wasters at worst and are easy to ignore. Disaster Movie just takes that concept and stretches it out into a full feature-length film. And is the length worth it? No, of course not. Why are you even asking? There's nothing of value to be held in this movie's humor. It has no real substance, no real passion, no purpose, no plot, no rhyme, no reason, and it's overall not funny. Spaceballs felt like it was a loving tribute to the subject it was parodying and knew what the balance was between respecting it and making fun of it. Disaster Movie has none of what made Spaceballs good or even memorable. It insults its source material and just opts for either low-hanging fruit or abundant gross-out humor that all gets old fast. So what we're left with is mildly boring schlock at best and tasteless garbage at worst. With all of this in mind, this is why I have absolutely no qualms with calling Disaster Movie my least favorite film of all time. Whew, that was a lot to get through. So, what can be taken away from this? When it comes to parody films, or even parody in general, there are certain lines to be drawn to make sure it actually works. Of course, not everything is going to land or make everybody laugh, but that doesn't automatically mean it won't work. It just means that people have different tastes in comedy than others, and that's okay. But even with such a wide variety of differing opinions, there should still be general rules to follow when making a parody. Make sure it's relevant to the topic at hand, make the purpose clear but not in your face, make sure it looks good, and most importantly of all, don't insult your audience's intelligence. You can make a parody as silly or outlandish as you like, as long as it makes sense as to why, but don't go out of your way to treat your audience like idiots in the process of doing so. Otherwise, instead of getting across whatever message you intended with your parody, all you're really going to be doing is alienating them and driving them away. No one's going to be able to get the joke if no one wants to listen to it in the first place. Spaceballs isn't a perfect movie, not in the slightest, but it is, in my opinion, a perfect example of how to make a good parody. The amount of respect it has for its source material is honestly astounding, especially if you're either a casual or hardcore Star Wars fan. And even if you're not either of those things, there's still more than enough to enjoy about the movie as a whole, mixing top-notch humor with genuinely compelling characters and a basic yet enjoyable plot. The fact that people are still remembering it, quoting it, and cosplaying from it years later just goes to show how well Spaceballs succeeded at standing the test of time. Sadly, it's films like Disaster Movie that give parodies a bad reputation, and when you think about it, are a major part of the reason why you don't see them in cinemas anymore. When you have disrespectful garbage like this, it puts a bad taste in people's mouths, and overall sours what could have been a genre full of endless opportunities. If there's ever a chance that parody films do make a comeback, then all I'll have to say is this: don't let the negative stuff push them away. Think about the good that can be done from this type of genre and what makes it work. If you want to avoid another Disaster Movie, then take a few lessons from Spaceballs. Thank you, and good night.